Hey nerdy knitters, have you ever knit a project only to find out that it didn't come out the size that you thought it would, and you had even done a gauge swatch? That's why a lot of knitters say that their gauge swatch lied to them. And yes, sometimes gauge swatches can lie, but there are some best practices you can do to ensure that your gauge swatch is telling you the truth, and we're going to go through all of those in this video. Before we do, I just want to say, hey, I'm Tanya here at Nerdy Knitting. I'm a certified knitting instructor and a knitwear designer, and my goal is to help you become a more confident, adventurous knitter. And you'll definitely be a more confident knitter when you know how to use your gauge swatch to accurately tell you how your knitting project is going to turn out. So let's dive in. Now, before we look at all those mistakes and the reasons your gauge swatch lies, I want to tell you 3 rules that you need to follow when you're knitting a gauge swatch. If you want your swatch to be accurate, you have to do these 3 things. Rule number 1, use the yarn and the knitting needles that you're going to use for the project. Now, this might seem self-explanatory, but some people miss this key element. You need to see how that yarn and those needles work together to create the fabric you want and get the gauge you want. If you have lots of different knitting needles, select the needles you're planning to use for the project and swatch with those specific needles. Rule number 2, you're going to knit the swatch the same way you're going to knit your final project. If your final project is worked in pieces, knit flat, then you're going to knit a flat swatch. But if your project is knit in the round, then your swatch also needs to be knit in the round. And again, in the same method as your project is going to be knit. If you're knitting your project in magic loop, then use magic loop for your swatch. If you're going to use double pointed needles for your project, then knit your swatch with double pointed needles. If you're using a large circular, then you're going to want to swatch with those large circular needles. Rule number 3, treat your swatch the same way you're going to treat your final project. And by this, I mean the washing and blocking stage. If you're going to hand wash your finished project, wring out the excess water, lay it flat to dry, then you're going to do the same thing to your swatch. If you're going to pin it out aggressively to open up that lace, then you're going to do the same thing to your swatch. Whatever you're going to do to that final project, that's how you're going to treat your swatch. Okay, now that we have those 3 rules out of the way, let's look at the reasons a swatch might lie to you. The first reason is you are knitting a tiny swatch. If you're knitting anything less than 4 inches, or if you're knitting exactly 4 inches because that's what the ball band told you to swatch, then that's too small. 4 inches is just some arbitrary number that they put on ball bands. It could have been 10 inches, it could be 1 inch, it could be 3 inches, it doesn't matter. That's just the number they put on the ball band. It does not mean that your swatch has to be 4 inches. I think it should be at least 6 inches and maybe even 8 to get the most accurate reading. The larger the swatch, the more accurate your measurements are going to be. But of course, avoid those wonky edge stitches when you're taking those measurements. And that leads me to the second reason your gauge swatch might be lying to you. You're adding border stitches. If you're working a gauge swatch in stockinette and you're adding a garter edge, then you could be affecting the row gauge of your swatch, because stockinette stitch and garter stitch have vastly different row gauge measurements. So if you're knitting a tiny swatch and you're also putting a garter stitch around the edge, you could be affecting the final measurements of that stockinette swatch. This might not be such a big deal if you knit larger swatches already, but the best thing to do is just to skip the border stitches and just knit in whatever fabric your swatch is supposed to be, not adding any border stitches to it at all. Now, the third reason your gauge swatch might lie is because you don't even knit a gauge swatch. You just take your measurements from the work in progress. You figure out which size you want to knit, you cast on right away, you knit a few inches, and then you take a little 4-inch square measurement or even just a 1-inch square measurement, and you use that to tell you if your gauge is correct or not. And if you refer back to those first 3 rules, then you can already see why this is a bad idea. If you're measuring a work in progress, you don't know how that garment is going to react after it's been washed and blocked and what the gauge measurements will actually be until you wash, block, and let it dry. And you're probably casting on, working just a few inches and measuring right away, which is also a bad idea because the further you get along in the project, the more relaxed you get and your knitting gauge can actually change and relax even more. So your gauge could get looser and the garment could end up larger than you intended. Do you really want to work 6 to 8 inches of a project, take your gauge measurements only to find out it's really wrong and you've got to rip it out and start over? Wouldn't it just be easier to knit a swatch? Another reason your swatch lies is because you're only measuring 4 inches, or some people even just measure 1 inch with those tiny, cute little 1-inch measurement gauges. Throw those things away. They are doing you no good. Get yourself a good hard-sided ruler and measure the largest area possible. Knit that large swatch and measure the whole thing minus those wonky edge stitches to get an accurate gauge measurement. There is no reason you have to measure just 4 inches or you just have to knit 4 inches. That's just some arbitrary number that's put on yarn labels. Throw that out and knit a large swatch. Now those are some of the things I've learned about swatching and knitting to make garments that fit. If you have additional tips or reasons swatches might lie, I would love to hear about them. So please leave me a comment and tell me about your experiences with swatching and measuring for gauge. And if you're looking for more tips and recommendations, go down and read those comments to see what other knitters have to say. I learned so much from the comments that people leave, and I know that you will too. And if you're looking for more knitting tips and advice that will help you improve your knitting, I've put together a short playlist just for you. You can check it out right here, and I'll see you in that next video.